It was just supposed to be a ride. Walter Jennings leaned into the wind as he cruised down Highway 17, just outside Summerville, South Carolina. His Harley rumbled beneath him, steady and low, as if it knew his rhythm. The tires hugged the blacktop, the road stretching ahead like an old friend. It was Sunday, his day. The only day he didn't owe anything to anyone. Not the VA. Not his busted backyard fence. Not even the kids on the block who always asked about his patches and medals. Just him, his machine, and that same familiar loop he'd ridden every weekend for the past 12 years. Walter was 52. Army retired. Desert Storm veteran. 21 years of service. 5 deployments. 2 worn-out knees. And a Purple Heart tucked away in a drawer he never opened. He wasn't one to talk much about where he'd been. But you could see it, in the way he moved. In how his eyes didn't flinch when voices rose. In the quiet discipline that made him wake up at 5:30 a.m. every morning, without fail. He wore the same vest for every ride, faded leather, tough as ever, with his old unit patch stitched across the back. And that hat, the one he wore the day he walked off base for the last time. Desert Storm veteran, it read, embroidered in gold thread. Usually, people nodded. Saluted. Waved. But not today. Convoy pull in like something out of a movie, tight, silent, efficient. The Humvees rolled up to the shoulder of the road, tires crunching gravel as they came to a synchronized halt. The lead vehicle parked directly behind the police cruisers. Doors opened. Boots hit pavement. Captain Elijah Brooks was the first to step out. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. Authority rolled off him in waves, pressed uniform crisp, campaign hat tilted low over sharp eyes. He walked toward the scene with a calm that said everything the officers should have already known. "Afternoon," he said, voice even. "Is there a reason Sergeant First Class Walter Jennings is being detained?" The 2 officers blinked, confused for half a second, then startled as the name clicked into place. He fits the description of a suspect, Elijah finished. "Yes, we heard that part. Black male, black motorcycle, wearing a vest." He gestured behind him. "You'll notice that could describe about 100 people in this state, but only one of them has spent 21 years serving this country, earning 5 commendations, and mentoring every man and woman standing behind me." The younger officer opened his mouth to speak again, but Elijah wasn't finished. "I understand the need for caution. I understand protocol. But what I don't understand," he said, stepping closer, "is why a decorated veteran, a scheduled guest of the National Guard, was not allowed to verify his identity with the very post expecting him." Walter still hadn't moved. He stood like stone, watching. He hadn't asked for this. He never would have. But he wasn't about to stop it either. The older officer, the one who'd stayed back earlier, was the first to lower his eyes. We didn't know who he was." Elijah's jaw clenched. "You had his military ID. You had his license. You had his destination. You chose not to listen. And now you've detained a man who's done more for this country than both of you combined have likely even thought about." More soldiers stepped out of the vehicles now. They weren't posturing. They weren't making noise. But their presence was undeniable, a living wall of respect behind one man in a weathered vest and a ball cap. The gas station crowd had grown too. More cell phones were out. No one was speaking, but everyone was recording. "Return his belongings," Elijah said quietly. The younger officer hesitated. "Now." The officer handed over Walter's wallet, his registration, and the military ID with stiff fingers. Walter took them without a word. Still calm. Still unshaken. Elijah turned to Walter then. "We've got your back, Sergeant. You ready?" Walter looked down the highway, then at his Harley. The wind had picked up again, tugging at the edges of his vest. "Yeah," he said, voice steady. "Let's ride." And he did. Walter mounted his bike, turned the key, and let the engine roar to life. The crowd watched as he pulled onto the road, Elijah riding beside him in the lead Humvee. The convoy followed, not in parade, but in silent escort. A moving shield of respect. Behind them, the two officers stood still, staring, sweating, suddenly very, very aware of the weight of the moment. Because what they thought was just another routine stop had become something else entirely. A reckoning. A reminder. That not all who ride alone are truly alone. And not all who serve ever stop commanding loyalty. Walter Jennings didn't need to fight that day. His army did it for him, the weight of a uniform. That evening, back at Fort Sterling, the sunset bled orange and gold across the horizon. The gates opened quietly to allow Walter through, no questions asked, no ID required this time. He parked his Harley near the admin building, the last rays of light gleaming off the chrome like a salute from the heavens. Inside, a welcome committee was waiting. Not formal, Walter hated fanfare, but his old team, men and women he'd served with, had heard what happened. They didn't say much, just nodded as he entered, like soldiers always did when words couldn't carry the weight. Captain Elijah Brooks pulled him aside. "You all right?" Elijah asked. Walter nodded slowly. "I've seen worse." "I know. But this shouldn't have been one of those things." Walter didn't answer right away. He walked to the far wall, where framed photos lined the hallway, images of men and women in combat, in service, in training. He stopped at one in particular, a photo from 2008, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. A younger Walter stood at the center, arms crossed, flanked by two Marines and a young private who didn't make it home. He stared for a long moment before speaking. "I've been stopped before. Followed in stores. Asked if I actually owned my own bike. But that's just the price, right? That's what they tell you, to stay calm, stay polite, stay alive." He turned, voice steady. "But today, they looked at me like I was dangerous. Not because of my actions. Just, my presence." Elijah's eyes dropped. He didn't interrupt. Walter stepped closer. "When I'm in uniform, they thank me. When I'm out of it, they treat me like a threat. Same man. Same values. Just different clothes." Cut to media frenzy. The next morning, the footage had gone viral. Videos of the incident spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up. Cable anchors debated whether the officers had made an honest mistake or a prejudiced assumption. Social media took sides, but the majority weren't silent this time. Hashtag Justice for Jennings. Hashtag Respect Our Vets. Hashtag Not all heroes wear capes, but some wear leather vests. Walter's inbox flooded with messages, from fellow veterans, from strangers, from young black bikers who saw him as proof they belonged, too. But one message stood out. It came from a 17-year-old named Dante, a JROTC student from Baton Rouge. "Sir, I saw what happened. I was thinking about quitting. Didn't think people like me ever got respect. But then I saw you. And I just wanted to say, thank you for being who you are, even when they tried to ignore it." Walter read it 3 times before replying. "You wear your uniform with pride, Dante. And never let anyone tell you you don't belong in it." Part 3, Echoes and Accountability. Meanwhile, the 2 officers from the incident, Officer Trent Maynard and Officer Colin Reeves, were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Public pressure mounted, especially after it was revealed that Walter had been pulled over 3 times in the past 6 months, always by different departments, always fitting a description. Mayor Eliza Guerrero held a press conference. Tensions were high. Protesters gathered with signs that read, "He served. You suspected, and veterans deserve more than apologies." Today, the mayor said, we are launching a full-scale review of traffic stop protocols, with special attention to racial profiling. Sergeant First Class Jennings deserves more than a private apology. He deserves a public reckoning. The officers issued a statement. It wasn't enough. Because for Walter, it was never just about him. Flashback, the fire that shaped him. Back in his small home in rural Mississippi, Walter sat on his porch, looking out at the fields. An old photo album lay open in his lap, his parents, both civil rights activists, beaming beside a young Walter in his junior ROTC uniform. He remembered being told not to walk alone at night. Not to wear hoodies. To smile more in stores. To never talk back to police. Even when you've done nothing wrong. He remembered the day he enlisted. His mother hugged him like she was letting go of a lifeline. Don't forget who you are, baby, she'd whispered. Don't let them define you by what they fear. He never had. Part 4, A Seat at the Table. A week later, Walter was invited to speak at a congressional hearing on racial bias in policing, especially as it affects veterans and service members of color. Standing before a room of lawmakers and cameras, he wore his dress blues. Some people say racism's a thing of the past, he began. They point to laws and policies. They say, we've come so far. And we have. But I need you to understand something. He paused, voice calm but heavy. When you're a black man on a motorcycle, in a vest, with a military ID, and they still see you as a threat, that's not the past. That's now. And I'm here to say, it has to change. The room was silent. Not out of dismissal, but because even the walls seemed to be holding their breath. Part 5, The Ride Home. Months passed. The headlines moved on. The hearings became bills, and the bills crawled through the system. But something had shifted. Walter still rode his Harley every Sunday. Still pulled into gas stations. Still wore his vest. Only now, when people saw him, they nodded with something deeper than politeness. Respect. Recognition. One morning, as he pulled into a diner off the highway, a small boy ran up to him. Couldn't have been older than 6. Held a toy soldier in his hand. You a real hero? He asked. Walter smiled. I try to be. And maybe that was enough. Because Walter Jennings didn't ride to prove anything anymore. He rode to remind us all. That integrity doesn't need permission. That dignity doesn't ask for approval. And that justice, when demanded with grace, roars louder than any engine ever could. Ripples in the silence. Months after the incident, Walter had become more than a headline. He had become a symbol, one not forged in loud speeches or viral outrage, but in quiet resilience. Local schools began inviting him to speak. Not just about military service, but about identity. About pride. About the quiet strength it took to stay composed when the world tried to provoke you into rage. At Lincoln High School, he stood before a room full of teenagers, some restless, some curious, others cautiously hopeful. He took off his leather vest and laid it gently on the table beside him. You see this patch? He asked, pointing to the faded insignia. That's not just fabric. That's sacrifice. That's 23 years of my life, wrapped in dust, sweat, and blood. A hand rose from the back. A young Latina student named Isabella. Were you scared, when they pulled you over? Walter didn't flinch. Yes. But I was more tired than scared. Tired of having to earn respect that should have been automatic. Tired of proving I belonged in every space I entered. He walked closer to them. But I stayed calm. Because I knew if I got angry, I would be the one they remembered. Not the badge. Not the mistake. Me. The auditorium fell silent. And in that silence, change began. Part 7, The Officer's Return. Officer Trent Maynard and Officer Colin Reeves returned to duty, but not without conditions. As part of their reinstatement, they were required to complete an intensive anti-bias training program, attend community restorative justice sessions, and, at Walter's request, sit down for a one-on-one meeting. It wasn't forgiveness. It was accountability. The meeting took place in a community center near Fort Sterling. A round table, no press, no cameras. Just 3 men. One truth. Walter entered last. The officers stood. "You don't have to stand," Walter said, his voice even. "We want to," Officer Reeves replied. "Out of respect." Walter sat down slowly. Looked them both in the eye. "I'm not here for an apology," he began. "I'm here for understanding. Because if you can't explain what happened to me, then how many others have you passed judgment on without a camera rolling?" Officer Maynard shifted. "I thought you were someone else. We had a call." Walter raised his hand, calm but firm. "You saw a black man on a bike and decided that matched your suspect. You didn't check my plates until after you drew your weapon. That wasn't about a call. That was about an instinct. And that instinct could have gotten me killed." They nodded. Swallowed hard. Didn't defend. Just listened. And for the first time since that day, Walter exhaled, not out of relief, but out of release. Because sometimes, the most radical act isn't confrontation. It's conversation. Part 8, Memorial Ride. On Veterans Day, Fort Sterling organized a citywide ride in Walter's honor, not because he asked for it, but because he'd become something rare. A bridge. Between law enforcement and community. Between silence and speech. Between uniform and identity. Hundreds gathered at the start line. Bikers from across Louisiana and beyond, veterans, civilians, off-duty officers, even kids on BMX bikes with mini flags taped to their handlebars. Walter sat on his Harley at the front, dressed in black denim and his patched leather vest. No rank. No ribbons. Just him. As the engines roared to life, a teenage boy stepped out from the crowd and handed him a helmet. It was airbrushed in brilliant red, white, and blue. Across the front, bold white letters read, "Respect is not a request." Walter looked at the boy, Dante, the same kid who had messaged him all those months ago. "You ride?" Walter asked. "Not yet," Dante grinned. "But I will." Walter nodded, then slid the helmet on. Part 9, Legacy. The story of Walter Jennings became a case study across police academies nationwide. His experience was integrated into training modules under the title, "The Cost of Assumption." But more importantly, it stayed alive in hearts. A mural was painted on the side of a community youth center in Baton Rouge. It showed Walter on his Harley, eyes forward, with a faint American flag behind him. Around his image were the words, "He stood so we could sit at the table. He rode so we could walk in dignity. He never asked for the mural. Didn't pose for it. But when he saw it, he simply said, 'Hope it makes them think before they pull someone over.'" Final scene, the long road. Years later, Walter stood outside his small home, now retired for good. He watched as Dante, now grown, in uniform, and fresh from officer training school, pulled up on a gleaming black bike. He took off his helmet and smiled wide. "Told you I'd ride," Dante said. Walter chuckled. "Looks like you made good on that." They shook hands, then hugged. "You ready to serve?" Walter asked. "With respect," Dante answered. Walter handed him the old leather vest, still bearing the faded insignia, still patched with memories. "This one's yours now." And as Dante rode off down the long stretch of road, Walter stood tall in the silence. A man who had carried the weight of expectation. Challenged the reflex of suspicion. And proved that sometimes, the quietest voice leaves the loudest echo. Fade out.